The morning sun peeked through the dusty windows of Pete's diner as Frank Thompson pushed open the heavy glass door at exactly 7 a.m. The small bell above the door chimed softly, announcing his arrival just as it had done every morning for the past 30 years. At 93 years old, Frank moved slower than he used to, but his routine never changed. "Good morning, Frank." Sarah, the waitress who had been working at Pete's for the last 8 years, called out with genuine warmth in her voice. She was already grabbing a clean white mug and the coffee pot, knowing exactly what her favorite customer needed to start his day. Frank's wrinkled face broke into a gentle smile as he made his way to his corner table. It wasn't officially reserved for him, but everyone in town knew that the small table by the window with the slight scratch on its surface was Frank's spot. His weathered hands, marked with age spots and years of hard work, gripped his wooden cane tightly as he carefully lowered himself onto the familiar red vinyl seat. "The usual, dear?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. She poured the steaming black coffee into his mug, making sure to leave enough room at the top so it wouldn't spill when Frank's hands trembled slightly. "Yes, please," Frank replied, adjusting the veteran's cap that sat proudly on his thin white hair. The faded blue cap, embroidered with World War II veteran in gold thread. Had seen better days, but Frank wore it every single day with quiet dignity. While Sarah went to put in his order, 2 eggs over easy and wheat toast, Frank began his morning ritual. From the pocket of his neat, well-worn brown jacket, he pulled out a small bottle of pills and carefully counted out his morning medications. Next came his small notebook, where he wrote down his thoughts and memories every day. The doctors had suggested this practice to help keep his mind sharp, and Frank took it seriously. The diner buzzed with its usual morning activity around him. The cook's spatula clinked against the grill, the coffee machine hummed, and the murmur of early morning conversations filled the air. Frank knew most of the regular customers by name, and they all knew him. There was Tom, the mailman, grabbing his breakfast before starting his route. Maria, the high school teacher, grading papers over her morning coffee, and old Joe, another veteran who would sometimes sit with Frank and share stories of their service days. As Frank sipped his coffee, his mind wandered back to memories of sharing breakfast with his late wife, Rose. She had loved this diner too, especially the way the morning light would catch the small crystal wind chimes hanging in the window, creating tiny rainbows on the table. After she passed away 30 years ago, Frank had started coming here every day, finding comfort in the familiar surroundings and friendly faces. Sarah returned with his breakfast, the eggs cooked just the way he liked them and the toast buttered perfectly. "Here you go, Frank. I added an extra slice of toast today. You're looking a bit thin," she said with motherly concern. Frank chuckled softly. "You sound just like Rose used to," he said, his voice warm with memory. "She was always trying to fatten me up too." As he ate his breakfast, Frank watched the world outside his window come to life. The small town of Millbrook was starting another day. Students waited at the bus stop across the street. Business owners unlocked their shops, and cars passed by in the morning rush. It was a simple scene, but to Frank, it represented everything he had fought for all those years ago, the freedom for ordinary people to live ordinary lives in peace. Little did Frank know that his peaceful morning routine was about to change. As he finished his last bite of toast and took a final sip of coffee, the rumble of motorcycle engines could be heard approaching the diner. The sound grew louder, and several customers looked up from their meals with concern, but Frank remained calm, focused on writing in his notebook, unaware that his quiet corner of the world was about to be disrupted in ways he couldn't imagine. The peaceful morning atmosphere at Pete's diner shattered as 5 motorcycles roared into the parking lot. The riders, members of a group calling themselves the Road Warriors, cut their engines but left behind a tension that filled the small diner. Leading them was Mike Johnson, a tall man with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos. The bell above the door barely had time to finish its gentle chime before the bikers' loud voices drowned it out. They swagger walked through the diner, their heavy boots thumping against the linoleum floor. The smell of leather and motorcycle exhaust followed them as they chose a table close to Frank's quiet corner. Sarah, the waitress, gripped her coffee pot tighter as she approached their table. Her usual warm smile looked strained. "Good morning, gentlemen. What can I get for you today?" "Coffee, black, and make it quick," Mike barked, not bothering to look up from his phone. His friends snickered, elbowing each other and making comments about the old-fashioned decor of the diner. Frank continued writing in his notebook, trying to focus on his morning routine. But it became increasingly difficult as the bikers' voices grew louder, their crude jokes and rough language filling the once peaceful space. "Hey, look at Grandpa over there," one of the younger bikers, Tommy, said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Think he's writing his will?" The group burst into laughter, causing several regular customers to look down uncomfortably at their plates. Frank's hand trembled slightly as he wrote, but he kept his dignity, pretending not to hear. Sarah watched the scene unfold with worry in her eyes as she served the bikers their coffee. She deliberately positioned herself between their table and Frank's, as if trying to shield him. "Be careful with that coffee, sweetheart," Mike said with a smirk. "Don't want it spilling like the old-timers probably does." More laughter followed. The morning went on this way, with the bikers making increasingly bold comments about Frank's age, his veteran's cap, and his careful movements. Other customers began to leave early, the usual comfortable atmosphere of Pete's Diner replaced by an uncomfortable tension. Tom, the mailman who usually stayed for a second cup of coffee, stopped by Frank's table before leaving. "You okay, Frank?" he asked quietly. "I can call someone if you need help." Frank looked up from his notebook and smiled gently. "I'm fine, Tom. Thank you for asking. I've seen worse than this in my time." The bikers continued their daily visits over the next week. Each morning, they arrived just after Frank, as if they were timing their entrance. They made it a game to see who could make the loudest noise or the rudest comment. They would rev their engines in the parking lot, slam doors, and scrape chairs across the floor. Old Joe, Frank's veteran friend, tried to confront them one morning. "Show some respect," he demanded, his voice shaking with anger. "That man fought for your freedom." Mike stood up, towering over Joe. "Freedom? Look around, old man. We got the freedom to sit wherever we want and say whatever we want. Isn't that what you fought for?" His friends laughed and high-fived each other. Sarah watched helplessly as her beloved diner changed. Regular customers started avoiding the morning rush, choosing to come later or find breakfast elsewhere. Even the morning sunlight seemed dimmer, no longer creating those tiny rainbows from the crystal wind chimes that Frank loved so much. Through it all, Frank maintained his routine. He arrived at 7 a.m. sharp, ordered his usual breakfast, took his medications, and wrote in his notebook. But those who knew him well could see the subtle changes: the slight stoop in his shoulders, the extra tremor in his hands, the way his eyes stayed fixed on his notebook instead of watching the world go by outside his window. What the bikers didn't know was that Frank was writing about them in his notebook, not with anger or hatred, but with a wisdom that came from his 93 years of life experience. He was waiting for the right moment, gathering his thoughts, preparing to teach these young men a lesson they would never forget. The third week of harassment at Pete's Diner began with dark clouds hanging over the small town of Millbrook. The weather seemed to match the mood inside the once cheerful restaurant. Frank Thompson sat at his usual corner table, but today something was different. His weathered hands held his coffee cup a bit tighter, and his tired eyes showed a hint of sadness that hadn't been there before. The road warriors had grown bolder with each passing day. They now spread themselves across 3 tables near Frank, deliberately creating a wall of leather jackets and loud voices around him. Mike, their leader, had noticed how Frank's hands shook more when they were nearby, and he seemed to take a cruel pleasure in it. "Hey, old-timer," Mike called out that morning, his voice cutting through the quiet diner. "Better hold that coffee with both hands. Wouldn't want another accident like yesterday." He was referring to when they had startled Frank by suddenly revving a motorcycle outside the window, causing him to spill his coffee. Sarah, the waitress, had reached her breaking point. She marched over to Mike's table, coffee pot trembling in her hand. "That's enough," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Mr. Thompson is a paying customer, just like you." Mike stood up slowly, using his height to intimidate her. "Oh, and what are you going to do about it, sweetheart? Refuse to serve us? Go ahead, there are plenty of other diners in town, but none that will put up with your nonsense." Old Joe spoke up from across the room. He had started coming to the diner earlier each day, worried about his friend Frank. The tension in the room grew thick as several of the bikers stood up. Tommy, the youngest of the group, knocked over his chair deliberately. The crash made several customers jump, and a young mother quickly gathered her children and hurried out the door. Pete himself, the diner's owner who usually stayed in the kitchen, emerged wearing his stained apron. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his round face red with concern and anger. "No problem," Mike said with a smirk. "Just having a friendly conversation about customer service." His friends laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. Frank continued writing in his notebook, but those nearby could see that his pencil had stopped moving. He was listening, taking in every word, every action. His breakfast sat untouched in front of him, the eggs growing cold. The bikers had started a new game. They would time their visits to coincide with Frank's medication routine. When he would reach for his pill bottle, they would bump his table or make sudden loud noises, causing him to drop his pills. Today was no different. As Frank carefully opened his pill bottle, Tommy walked past, deliberately knocking into his table. The small white pills scattered across the floor. The bikers roared with laughter as Frank slowly got up, leaning heavily on his cane. But before he could bend down, something unexpected happened. Maria, the high school teacher who had been quietly grading papers, rushed over. Without a word, she knelt and began collecting the pills. Tom the mailman joined her, and soon several other customers were helping too. The bikers watched, momentarily silenced by this show of community support. Mike's face darkened with anger. This wasn't going according to plan. He wanted the old man isolated, intimidated. "Look at that," he sneered. "The old-timer needs an entire army to pick up his pills. Bet that's not what you had in mind when you were in the real army. Huh, Gramps?" Frank slowly raised his eyes from his notebook. For the first time since the harassment began, he looked directly at Mike. There was something in that gaze that made the biker leader shift uncomfortably in his seat. It wasn't fear or anger in the old veteran's eyes. It was understanding, mixed with something else that Mike couldn't quite identify. The diner had grown completely silent. Even the usual sounds from the kitchen had stopped. Everyone could sense that something was about to change. Frank closed his notebook carefully, removed his reading glasses, and folded them into their case. The quiet dignity of his movements drew all eyes to him. The time for silence was over. Frank Thompson, the 93-year-old veteran who had faced things these young men couldn't imagine, was ready to speak. The morning sun cast long shadows through Pete's diner's windows as the tension reached its peak. Frank Thompson sat at his usual corner table, but today was different. His coffee cup sat untouched, steam rising in the cold morning air. The road warriors had arrived earlier than usual, their faces showing cruel anticipation for what they had planned. Mike nodded to Tommy, who walked over to the counter and ordered a fresh cup of coffee. The young biker took his time walking back to his table, deliberately passing close to Frank's corner. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Tommy's boot caught the leg of Frank's chair. The biker stumbled, and his hot coffee flew through the air. The dark liquid splashed across Frank's lap, staining his neat brown trousers. Several customers gasped. Sarah dropped her order pad, and Pete stepped out from the kitchen, his face red with anger. "Oops," Tommy said with fake concern. "Sorry, old-timer. Guess my hands aren't as steady as they used to be. Know what that's like, don't you?" The bikers burst into loud laughter, but their laughter died quickly. Frank Thompson was standing up. For the first time in weeks, his hands weren't shaking. He rose slowly but steadily, pushing himself up with both hands on the table. At his full height, even with his slight stoop, there was something commanding about his presence. He carefully removed his veteran's cap and placed it on the table. The diner fell completely silent. Even the sizzling grill in the kitchen seemed to quiet down. Every eye was fixed on the old veteran as he stood, coffee dripping from his clothes, dignity intact. "Young man," Frank said, his voice clear and steady. It wasn't loud, but it carried across the silent diner. "Would you like to hear a story?" Mike stood up aggressively. "We're not interested in your war stories, old man." "Oh, but I think you are," Frank continued, his voice gaining strength. "Because this story isn't about war. It's about a young man, not much older than Tommy here, who thought strength meant causing pain to others." Frank's eyes swept across the diner, taking in every face. That young man was me. The unexpected confession caught everyone off guard. Even the bikers stopped their sneering and listened. "I was 19 years old, full of anger and pride," Frank continued. "I thought being tough meant making others feel small, until one morning in 1944 when I learned what real strength looks like." Frank slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. From it, He extracted a worn, black and white photograph. His fingers traced its edges with gentle care. This photo was taken the day I learned that lesson. Would you like to see it, Mike? Mike hesitated, his tough guy facade cracking slightly. After a moment, curiosity got the better of him, and he stepped forward to look at the photograph. The image showed a much younger Frank, still in his battle uniform, kneeling beside a small Japanese girl. They were both smiling, and the girl was holding what appeared to be a piece of chocolate. Her name was Sakura, Frank said softly. We found her hiding in the ruins of her village. She hadn't eaten in days. But instead of being afraid of us, the enemy soldiers who had been fighting her people, she smiled and offered to share her last piece of candy with me. Frank's voice grew stronger. That's when I understood what true strength is. It's not about how loud you can be, or how much fear you can cause. It's about how much kindness you can show when everything around you screams for vengeance. The coffee was still dripping from Frank's clothes, but nobody moved to clean it up. The power of his words held everyone frozen in place. Even the toughest of the bikers seemed unable to look away from the old veteran's face. So, young men, Frank continued, his eyes now fixed directly on Mike. Would you like to hear the rest of the story? Because I promise you, it's not the story you think you know. The morning light in Pete's diner seemed to soften as Frank Thompson began his story. The coffee stains on his pants were forgotten, and even the youngest biker, Tommy, had pulled up a chair to listen. Mike remained standing, but his aggressive stance had melted away, replaced by an uncertain shift in his weight from foot to foot. After we found Sakura, Frank continued, his voice steady and clear, our unit was assigned to help rebuild her village. We were soldiers turned construction workers overnight, but there was one particular family that changed everything for me. Frank's weathered hands smoothed out another photograph from his wallet. This one showed a beautiful Japanese woman in a traditional kimono, standing next to a younger version of Frank in his dress uniform. They were both beaming at the camera. This is Rose, Frank said softly. Sakura's older sister. She became my wife 2 years after the war ended. A sharp intake of breath came from Mike's direction. His face had gone pale, and his hands were gripping the back of a chair so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Rose? Mike's voice cracked as he spoke. Rose Thompson? Frank's eyes met Mike's, and suddenly, understanding passed between them. Yes, Frank nodded. Rose Thompson from Millbrook, but before that she was Rose Tanaka from Osaka. Mike stumbled backward until he found a chair to sink into. My grandmother, he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. My grandmother's name was Rose Thompson. The other bikers looked confused, but realization was dawning on the diner's regular customers. Old Joe nodded slowly, a sad smile crossing his face. He had known all along. Rose passed away 30 years ago, Frank continued, his voice thick with emotion. But before she did, she made me promise to keep telling our story. The story of how love can grow in the most unexpected places, even in the midst of war and hatred. Frank pulled out one more photograph. This one showed Rose holding a baby, with young Frank standing proudly beside them. This was taken the day your father was born, Mike. Your grandmother used to bring him to this very diner every morning, just like I do now. The tough biker leader's facade crumbled completely. Tears formed in his eyes as memories of his grandmother's stories about her early life came flooding back. Stories he had dismissed as a child, too busy being angry at the world to listen. She used to tell me about a soldier, Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. A kind American soldier who shared his chocolate with her little sister, who helped rebuild their village. Who? His voice broke. Who became her husband. Sarah quietly brought a fresh cup of coffee to Frank's table and began cleaning up the spilled coffee. The other customers watched in stunned silence as the scene unfolded. I never knew, Mike continued, looking at his hands. I never made the connection. Grandma Rose always told me to be kind, to look for the good in people. She said she learned that from a soldier in the war. He looked up at Frank, his eyes filled with shame. From you. Frank reached out and placed a gentle hand on Mike's shoulder. Rose would be proud of you for realizing this, Mike. It's never too late to change your path. She always believed that. Tommy, the young biker who had spilled the coffee, stood up suddenly. I'm sorry, sir, he blurted out. We didn't know. We were just being tough. Frank finished for him with a knowing smile. I understand. I was young once too. But let me tell you about real toughness. Real toughness is what your grandmother showed, Mike, when she chose to forgive the soldiers who had been her enemies. Real toughness is what Sakura showed when she offered her last piece of candy to a stranger. The diner had grown quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was the quiet of understanding, of walls coming down, of healing beginning. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, but nobody in Pete's diner seemed to notice the time passing. The regular breakfast crowd had stayed long past their usual departure time, caught up in the unfolding story. Mike sat at Frank's table now, his leather jacket unzipped, his tough guy image forgotten. "Tell me more about her," Mike asked softly, his eyes fixed on the old photograph spread across the table. "About Grandma Rose, there's so much I never knew." Frank's eyes lit up with memories. "Your grandmother was the strongest person I've ever known," he began. "When we started rebuilding her village, she was the first to pick up a hammer. She couldn't have been more than 20, but she organized everyone, created work schedules, even taught English to the children while we worked." Sarah quietly refilled coffee cups around the diner as everyone listened. Even the other bikers had pulled their chairs closer, their earlier hostility replaced with genuine interest. "But there's something else you should know, Mike," Frank continued, pulling out his worn notebook. "Something your grandmother asked me to do after she passed away. Every morning, I come here and write stories about her life, about our life together. I promised her I would keep her memory alive." Mike's hands trembled as he accepted the notebook Frank offered him. As he opened it, his eyes widened. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, each entry dated and carefully preserved. He began to read aloud. "April 15, 1994. Today would have been our 47th anniversary. Rose, our grandson Mike started high school this week. He has your spirit, your fire, but he's angry, just like I was at his age. I wish you were here to guide him." Mike's voice cracked as he continued reading. "September 3, 2000. Mike joined a motorcycle club today. You would have worried, Rose, but you would have understood. He's looking for somewhere to belong, just like we were all those years ago." The other bikers shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Mike read. Tommy, who had been the loudest in mocking Frank, looked down at his hands, shame evident on his young face. "Every single day," Frank explained gently, "I write to Rose, about our family, about our town, about the changes I see. And lately," he paused, looking at the bikers, "about the young men who remind me so much of myself at their age." Mike looked up from the notebook, tears streaming down his face. "All this time," he whispered, "you knew who I was? Even when we were—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Frank nodded. "Rose always said that sometimes people need time to find their way. She believed in patience and understanding. She taught me that the hardest hearts often need the most gentleness." The impact of Frank's words hit everyone in the diner differently. Old Joe wiped his eyes quietly in the corner. Maria, the teacher, was furiously taking notes, perhaps planning a lesson about forgiveness and understanding. Pete himself stood in the kitchen doorway, his arms crossed, nodding slowly. One of the bikers, a large man named Bear, suddenly spoke up. "My grandfather was in the Pacific too," he said quietly. "He never talked about it, said it was too painful. But maybe he had stories like yours." Frank turned to him with a gentle smile. "Everyone has stories, son. The trick is being brave enough to share them, and wise enough to listen when others share theirs." The morning had grown into early afternoon, but nobody moved to leave. The regular customers who had been avoiding the diner because of the bikers were starting to trickle back in, drawn by the unusual scene of the leather-clad men sitting quietly around the old veteran, listening to his stories. Mike carefully closed the notebook and handed it back to Frank. "I want to learn more," he said firmly. "About Grandma Rose, about you, about everything I was too angry to listen to before." Frank's eyes twinkled as he reached for his coffee cup. "Well then," he said, "I believe we have a lot of breakfasts ahead of us." A week had passed since the revelations at Pete's diner, and the morning routine had changed dramatically. Frank still arrived at 7 a.m. sharp, but he was no longer alone at his corner table. Mike and his fellow bikers had become regular breakfast companions, their motorcycles lined up neatly outside instead of being carelessly scattered across the parking lot. On this particular morning, Mike arrived early, carrying a large cardboard box. His leather jacket was clean and zipped up properly, and he had trimmed his beard. The other regulars noticed the change in his appearance. but even more striking was the change in his demeanor. "Good morning, grandfather," Mike said softly as he approached Frank's table. The word felt strange, but right on his lips. After discovering their connection, he had asked Frank's permission to call him that. Frank looked up from his notebook with a warm smile. "Good morning, son. What do you have there?" Mike placed the box carefully on the table. "I spent the weekend cleaning out my garage and found something I think you should see." He opened the box and pulled out an old photo album, its covers worn but well preserved. "These were grandma roses," Mike explained, his voice thick with emotion. "Mom gave them to me years ago, but he paused, swallowing hard. "I was too angry to care about old pictures back then." As they opened the album together, Sarah brought over fresh coffee and extra cups. The other bikers began arriving, but today they entered quietly, respectfully. Tommy, who had changed the most, held the door open for an elderly couple entering the diner. "Look at this one," Frank said, pointing to a yellowed photograph. "This was taken at the village school we helped rebuild. Rose taught English there for 6 months before we got married." Bear, the large biker who had mentioned his grandfather, leaned in to look. "My grandfather might have been there," he said thoughtfully. "He was stationed in the Pacific, too." "What was his name?" Frank asked. "James Miller," Bear replied. "But everyone called him Big Jim." Frank's eyes widened with recognition. "Big Jim Miller. He helped us build the school's roof. He was the strongest man in our unit." Frank quickly flipped through his notebook and found an entry. "Here, I wrote about him just last month, remembering the day he lifted an entire beam by himself." Bear's tough exterior cracked as tears formed in his eyes. "I never knew," he whispered. "He never talked about the war. Died taking his stories with him." "Not all of them," Frank said gently, tearing the page from his notebook and handing it to Bear. "Some stories live on through others." The transformation in the diner was remarkable. The once rowdy bikers now sat quietly, absorbed in Frank's stories and the old photographs. They asked thoughtful questions and shared their own family histories. Tommy, who had been the most aggressive in bullying Frank, had started helping Sarah serve coffee to the elderly customers. His face showed genuine concern when he noticed their shaking hands, carefully placing cups within easy reach. Pete emerged from the kitchen, carrying a freshly baked apple pie. "Rose's recipe," he announced proudly. "Found it in an old cookbook this morning. Thought it was time to bring it back." The smell of cinnamon and apples filled the diner as Pete served slices to everyone. Mike took a bite and closed his eyes. "It tastes just like I remember," he said softly. "Grandma used to make this every Sunday." Frank wrote in his notebook as everyone enjoyed the pie. Today's entry was different from his usual letters to Rose. Instead of memories, he wrote about hope, about transformation, about the power of stories to heal old wounds and build new bridges. The morning light streamed through the windows, creating those tiny rainbows from the crystal wind chimes that Frank loved so much. But now, instead of watching them alone, he had a family of unlikely friends sharing in their beauty. "You know," Mike said, looking around at his fellow bikers, "we've been thinking. The Road Warriors isn't the right name anymore." He paused, looking at Frank. "How does Rose's Riders sound?" 1 month had passed since the morning that changed everything at Pete's diner. The early autumn sun shone through the windows as Frank Thompson made his way to his corner table, but the diner looked different now. New photographs hung on the walls, old black and white images of Rose, Frank, and their life together, carefully framed and arranged by Mike and his friends. The biggest change, however, was happening outside. Every Saturday morning, the parking lot of Pete's diner filled with motorcycles, but not just those belonging to Mike's group. Veterans from all over the county had started showing up after hearing about the unlikely friendship between the 93-year-old World War II veteran and the former Road Warriors, now proudly known as Rose's Riders. This particular Saturday morning was special. Frank arrived to find the diner decorated with American flags and Japanese paper lanterns. Sarah had helped Mike arrange this surprise to celebrate 1 month of their new Veterans Breakfast Club. "Grandfather," Mike called out as Frank entered, "we have something to show you." He guided Frank to a newly installed wooden plaque near the entrance. It read, "Rose's Corner, where stories unite us." Dedicated to Rose Thompson, who taught us that love knows no boundaries. Frank's hands trembled as he touched the plaque, but this time not from age, from emotion. The diner was packed with people. The original Rose's riders in their new leather jackets, now emblazoned with a rose design, veterans of various ages, and regular customers who had become part of this growing family. Bear stood up, holding his coffee cup. My grandfather's story isn't lost anymore, he announced. Thanks to Frank's notebooks, I now know more about Big Jim Miller than I ever did, and I've started writing my own stories too. Tommy, who had traded his rebellious attitude for a genuine desire to help others, was helping an elderly veteran with his breakfast. He had started volunteering at the local VA hospital, inspired by Frank's stories of healing and redemption. But that's not all, Mike said, leading Frank to a table covered with notebooks. Dozens of them, all different colors and sizes. Everyone here has started writing their stories, just like you do. We're creating a library of memories. Sarah brought out a special breakfast, eggs over easy and wheat toast, but arranged to form a smile on the plate, just as Rose used to do for young Mike when he visited his grandmother. Pete emerged from the kitchen carrying a large cake decorated with an American flag on one side and a Japanese flag on the other, connected by a bridge of roses. The best part, Mike continued, his voice full of pride, is what we're doing with these stories. He handed Frank a freshly printed flyer. It announced weekly storytelling sessions at the local high school, where veterans would share their experiences with students, teaching them about war, peace, and the power of understanding. Maria, the teacher who had helped pick up Frank's pills that fateful day, stepped forward. My students can't wait to hear your stories, Mr. Thompson. They've already started a peace and cultural exchange club inspired by your and Rose's story. Frank sat in his usual spot, overwhelmed by the changes his simple act of patience and storytelling had brought about. The diner was no longer just a place to eat. It had become a sanctuary where people from all walks of life came together to share, learn, and heal. Rose would have loved this, Frank said softly, opening his notebook to write. But before he could start, Mike placed a hand gently on his shoulder. Actually, grandfather, he said, today we'd like you to tell us the story in person. All of it, from the beginning. The diner fell quiet as Frank looked around at the faces before him, young and old, veteran and civilian, all united in this moment. The morning sun created those familiar tiny rainbows from the crystal wind chimes, now joined by new ones from the Japanese lanterns. Well, Frank began, his clear voice carrying to every corner of the diner. It all started with a piece of chocolate and a little girl named Sakura, who taught a young, angry soldier that kindness is the greatest strength of all. As Frank spoke, Sarah moved quietly among the tables, refilling coffee cups and wiping away tears. Pete stood in his kitchen doorway, nodding proudly. The transformation was complete. From a simple diner to a place where stories healed hearts, where past met present, and where Rose's spirit of love and understanding lived on through every word shared and every friendship formed.